Hi, everyone, and welcome to the free Assange online vigil series. My name is Taylor Hudak, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Andrew Smith and Steve Poikinen. Christy will be joining us later in the evening.
And welcome to the free Assange online vigil.
And my apologies about that. Yes, Christy will be joining us later on in the stream. But before we get to the news portion of the evening, and before we touch on our plans for London and DC, we are joined by a very special guest this evening, Patrick Henningsen. Patrick is a writer and the founder of 21st Century Wire, and he is also a global affairs commentator. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
I'm very great. Great to be with you, Taylor.
So I know that you are located in the UK, and you had an opportunity to attend Julian Assange's most recent hearing, which took place last Thursday, so it'll be a week tomorrow. Can you talk about what we learned from that hearing?
Yeah, last Thursday that was at the Westminster Magistrates Court in central London, and it was a case management hearing. So periodically there are case management hearings so that the defense team can communicate with the judge and the prosecution as well to organize, when things are going to happen, when the next court date is. So there was a lot of decisions to be made last week, and the hearing is scheduled to start on February 24th, which is coming up very quick. This is the U.S. extradition hearing, but it was unknown how long that hearing was going to be. And what we learned on Thursday is that there's going to be a bifurcated hearing, a two-part hearing. There will be 1 week in February. That'll be on the 24th, and that will extend into the first few days of March. And then there's going to be a break. The reason there's a break is because actually the prosecution, the key member of the prosecution's team, the United States' legal team that's trying to extradite Assange, has another historic landmark case in Ireland, I believe. So they were not able to do that. The judge got a little bit upset because she wasn't made aware of that was going to be an issue. It turns out that this may help the defense somewhat because they do need more time to prepare. They have witnesses to brief. Evidence has to be submitted by both sides, and both sides need time to review the evidence as well. And of course, Julian Assange's defense team need time to brief witnesses. Not only that, they need more time with their client, with Julian Assange as well, because their time has been limited, intentionally so by it seems by the prison services have in a bureaucratic way limited access between Julian Assange and his defense team over the last many months while he's been in Belmarsh, which is one of the big injustices, of course, of this story. But they might not have the element of surprise with the prosecution, because the prosecution has a lot of time to prepare as well. But at least that the defense will have enough time to prepare. All evidence should be submitted by the second week of February, probably, or at the very latest, the third week of February. So I think the judge will not allow new evidence to be submitted at that point. So it's a complex case. It involves cyber digital forensics. There's a lot of different important expert testimonies that are technical as well. Julian Assange himself is an important technical witness in this case as well. So it's more complex and more complicated than your average extradition case, to put it lightly. So they have political arguments that they're going to make in the first week of February, and these are things like, for instance, is Julian Assange being politically persecuted, and in that sense, it would automatically be in violation of international treaties, extradition treaties between the U.S. and Britain. Those arguments are going to be made, but the judge will not rule on them in the first week. Will rule on them later, unfortunately. but those arguments will be made. Also, abuse of process, that the British justice system has been abusing the process, and then that itself means that Assange hasn't received ample and proper justice as well. There's those types of arguments, and so there's a few other similar process arguments that are going to be made in that first week. So a lot of theoretical and legal challenges and law, international law will come into it as well. And then witnesses and evidence on May 18th, and that will be 3 weeks, three weeks long, that second half of the trial. So, and there was a few revelations that came out on the steps outside the courtroom afterwards. WikiLeaks editor Christian Harfison made a statement that many people probably saw, that according to his reviewing of some of the defense documents that he saw coming from the U.S. side, that they will be wanting to strip Assange of his First Amendment rights when he arrives on U.S. soil. So if you think about that, what is that? That's what a terrorist who's been rendered to Guantanamo Bay, offshore, off the mainland of the U.S., would be treated in that way. So he'll be taken to the U.S., won't be given any First Amendment protection. That's highly unusual, and it's highly illegal, highly everything. So it's hard to put into words exactly what they're trying to do there, but they've already reclassified him as not a journalist, and WikiLeaks is not a publisher. So this is another desperate move to try to shore up that side of things, because the whole U.S. Department of Justice case is predicated on reframing Assange and WikiLeaks not as a journalist and a publisher, but as a cyber terrorist and a hostile foreign intelligence agency. So now they've done this, plus he would be under special administrative measures, which would be like a Gitmo prisoner. Their legal team will not be allowed to speak to the U.S. media. So a total media blackout. So this doesn't look very good. To me, it looks like it smacks of desperation by the United States. That's how I look at it. I know it's horrible situation, but it smacks of desperation. In fact, all of the indictments, to me, and the fact that they want to reframe him, clearly an award-winning, journalist, and WikiLeaks clearly a publisher, to try to reframe the whole thing, because all of the indictments hinge on that reframing. Basically, it's on the link.
I want to unpack that a little bit more thoroughly, but before I do that, how does the Spanish case against UC Global, how does that play into, because it seems like it would benefit the defense team. They're not calling witnesses until May. But I don't know if there's a statute of limitations. They can't call witnesses while there's still a trial ongoing. Do you know anything about that? Can you speak on it?
Yeah. The UC Global thing, that will definitely benefit, no matter what. It's going to benefit the defense. It's going to benefit Assange. In fact, that could be a deal breaker. That incident, if that issue gets elevated and is seen, look, the courts are biased, clearly. If you look at the whole process, the fact they rubber stamped this extradition order, the Home Secretary, the previous Home Secretary, who they shuffled out of that position after he rubber stamped that, they're very biased. It's a closed shop for the judiciary. But there's a breaking point. There are limits, even with a biased judiciary. There's limits of what you can get away with in the public view without completely tarnishing the reputation of your country and the image of it being a fair and balanced legal system. So the Spanish case is absolutely important, because that could actually turn it into a politically charged, with the CIA were spying on his lawyers, essentially using a private firm. That's the deal breaker for extradition in a lot of people's eyes. So
absolutely. We've talked about a little bit on the vigils in the past about, as the breakdown of rule of law continues and becomes more grotesque and more in your face and more absurd, the recourse to that, it has got to be a large public presence and a large education campaign that obviously is going to have to take place in forums like this, or on my show Slow News Day, or on a number of other fantastic content creators that are willing to discuss Julian Assange. It with the US presidential election coming up, do you honestly think the outcome of that election will have anything to do with the outcome of Julian Assange's future?
That's a good question. I would. There's two ways you can look at that. One is that if, for instance, a Democrat was elected, for instance, like let's say a Bernie Sanders, there's a potential for some sort of a lifeline for Julian Assange because there might be more pressure coming from that side of the aisle, from liberal America, from left-wing America, that might see this as an important issue. It should be a right and a left issue for everybody. But of course, with this president, it won't be. Whatever Trump ignores, his base ignores. Whatever Trump gives attention to, his base are attentive to. So if Trump is disavowing WikiLeaks, as he has done publicly recently, say, "Oh, I don't know anything about WikiLeaks. Oh, it's not my thing." After of course, he knows about WikiLeaks. They helped him get elected. So is Trump going to be, if he's reelected, will he be more lenient in a second term because he doesn't feel like he's got the pressure of having to, distance himself from anything that's remotely Russian, for instance? But I personally don't think so. I don't think it makes a difference because I see the entire system in America gearing itself against against WikiLeaks, against Assange, against the idea of whistleblowers. Obama was very aggressive towards whistleblowers. The Republicans are now in power. They're doing more or less the same thing. Look at Chelsea Manning. I mean, extorting a grand a day, trying to get her to turn state's evidence. It's ridiculous. But so I don't think it's a partisan issue as much. I hope that would be, maybe one way or the other. There might be some logic that could play into that, but I think the important thing about Julian Assange is with regards to U.S. politics. Just look at the Roger Stone trial. Look at the Roger Stone trial. What was the result of the Roger Stone trial? All it did was prop up the narrative that Russia hacked the DNC and gave the emails to WikiLeaks. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter, as long as the state puts that in the preference of those proceedings. And the same with the impeachment trial. The same. They have to renew that narrative again and again. They have to reinforce it every time. So it's like these legal theaters or formalities for overarching U.S. foreign policy that has to be anti-Russian, new Cold War, arms race. This is where the U.S. state is with this issue. So in that sense, I don't think there's going to be much clemency. Julian Assange's best hope in the U.S. would be a Supreme Court appeal, would be to a higher court, because then they have to define the First Amendment in the context of this case. So that's a 2-3 year process, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. We just found out that the DNC fraud lawsuit is potentially headed to the Supreme Court. And I am personally ecstatic about that. And I've had Jared back on my show a couple of times. I've really enjoyed the conversations that we've been able to get out of those few hours. And a little bit more to the point about hammering home Russiagate, WikiLeaks, and whatnot. Adam Schiff spent the better part of a couple of days trying to run that back through the old smear factory and see what he couldn't print up again. This far into the Russiagate narrative, it blows my mind that people are still willing to believe it, because not only has there never been any evidence, there's never been anything that Congress has done specifically other than like token statements about fixing our electoral process, fixing our election system. They've got private source code that no one can read for the voting machines. They've got the voting machines up for bid and contract as to who gets to run them, who gets to run the software and own the proprietary software. It's the worst dog and pony show I've ever seen in my life, Patrick. It is.
The worst thing that happened to me when a couple of years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, I landed in Austin, Texas. I dialed up a Lyft on the app. My driver came. She was about 23, 24, musician, college student. And she started asking me what I did. I said, I'm a journalist. Oh, who do you work for? And then I was like, oh God, I have to sort of, and I mentioned RT, and she recoiled. And this was the first person I interacted with when I came back to, my home country. And I couldn't believe it that she said, well, they meddled in the election, and this and that, and the Russians. And at that point, I realized how powerful propaganda is. And I didn't really realize it before, because I just would laugh at CNN and think Fox, of course, they're putting out propaganda because they're media, that's what they do. But when you realize the impact that's had on a mass scale, that people actually believe that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, so as if people didn't go out and vote for who they voted for, or didn't vote for who they didn't vote for. But that's quite a frightening thing. And at that point, there's not a lot you can say.
It's been very
regards
effective
to,
too.
yeah, go ahead.
And I'm curious, your thoughts on how the American corporate media has really, they've done a really good job at repeating CIA talking points and these falsehoods about Julian Assange and about this case. And as a journalist, I mean, that is something that you don't do. You don't repeat false statements. And it just seems like they're being very lazy with it, where I feel that if this was any other story, they wouldn't be as lazy or as willing to mislead the public.
I mean, if you're asking my opinion on that, as a journalist, maybe you're not supposed to do that, but I think most American journalists now do that as a matter of routine, whether those are print journalists or broadcast journalists. Of course, TV are the worst, but radio, you hear it on the radio as well. Radio is more partisan in America, very, very partisan radio, but TV, they're bad. Print, they're not great either. So there's a real problem in America with the truth, and that's my big complaint about the whole, the Russiagate, the fake news crisis, which was a fake crisis, is that Americans, not all Americans, but a lot, and the media and politicians who parrot these talking points have become addicted to lying. They're almost painting a completely different version of reality, whether it's in the US or globally, than is really there. I don't think anything good can ever come of that. And I'm afraid I thought it was going to end, and that condition was going to dissipate after a couple of years. And here we are. There is just as deep into, as Steve said, into Russiagate, with Adam Schiff grandstanding at the Senate trial, saying the most outrageous things about, we need the Ukraine to fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. I mean, as if we're watching Red Dawn again with Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze.
My one hope through all of this Russiagate nonsense is that we would get a decent reboot of Spies Like Us, but no, it's freaking Red Dawn all over again. Like, give me the Chevy Chase and Martin Short if we're gonna do it. It's a goddamn cartoon anyway. Adam Schiff is one of the most blatantly in the pocket of the national security state members of Congress that we have. And I tend to agree with you, Patrick, when you said that the outcome of the election won't, more than likely won't have an effect on the outcome of Julian Assange's future, mostly because the Democratic Party is saturated with those national security ghouls and CIA Democrats and people who exist to make the lives of defense contractors easier and more plush. And until we decouple government, let me put it this way: we don't have a government that then has an intelligence agency. We have global intelligence that have governments, And until we decouple ourselves from that dynamic, I don't put a lot of store in just stock in national politics. I think that at a state or a local level you have a little bit better chance, but at the federal level we've got to find a way to flip the dynamic and put government in charge of intelligence agencies again, which is why what Susie Dawson is doing is so important with the One versus Five Eyes.
Yeah, yeah. The Five Eyes intelligence sharing network. This is where we're at right now in the 21st century. Is you have this uniformity of narratives, of beliefs, of beliefs about information. This is a real thing now between the Five Eyes countries, especially. It's a fraternal organization if you think about it. It's the United States, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Those are all English speaking. British Commonwealth countries, and then the United States is a not British Commonwealth country, but all English speaking. So this is an Anglo-American dominated setup, okay, an Atlanticist dominated setup. And the media will toe the line on whether it's Duma or Scribal or whatever. The media toes exactly the same line as the political establishment. In fact, this is formalized. This is formalized in an agreement which was announced by the British Prime Minister Theresa May at the G7 in, I believe it was June of 2017. She announced the rapid reaction mechanism, and this mandates that they must all have the same party line and cannot veer from the official line on any major international event, so as not to give any succor to the Russians. This is formalized. It was announced. It's you can look it up on the British government's website. So that includes the Five Eyes. That includes the heads of state. Includes the State Department, especially. More important in this is the State Department and the Foreign Office, and that's more important because that's the public-facing voice of policy for the country. So this is a big problem with Julian Assange. Taylor talked about lies and untruths that are one of the reasons why he is where he is right now. One of the big ones, of course, was the Swedish sexual assault case. Okay, when that was lifted, when Sweden finally dropped it for the third time, this past summer or fall, I think. I can't remember exactly when it was. But when they did that, then I knew that the support would the winds would shift in the favor of Julian Assange, because that freed up the progressive left, so that this is now a safe issue to support. Before that, there were questions, and you had so this is very clever how he was framed with that case, and how they left that hanging over his neck like the sword of Damocles. And that so the feminists were afraid to support him, the LGBTs were afraid to support him. This is a reality of politics, and this is how his support had been shattered and fractured, and the left. And this is also how they fracture the anti-war left after the Iraq War. It's been done through various human rights campaigns. It's been done through Avaz. It's been done through Amnesty International, human rights, Afghanistan. Let's keep the progress going. They said at the NATO summit in 2012, I believe, with pictures of women covered and with NATO's logo on it, basically saying, let's keep the progress going. It was the first feminist war, unofficially. So, but that's how they broke up the left anti-war movement after Iraq, was to divide people. Libya became a feminist issue, with reports that Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice were circulating about Gaddafi issuing Viagra to his troops to commit mass rape, for instance. CNN did the same thing before the fall, the liberation of Aleppo in 2016. They circulated stories about Assad soldiers were going to commit mass rape. The Daily Beast ran a story that women were committing suicide so that they wouldn't be raped by Assad's evil soldiers. Michael Wise, CNN senior correspondent, put that fake news out. Okay. That's documented. So at every juncture, we see these issues being used to divide public support for or against issues like war, like Julian Assange. It's very, very well engineered. This is how propaganda has become much more sophisticated in the last couple of years.
With the whole Russiagate narrative too, what they've successfully done is create this counter-reinforcing propaganda circle, to where you have the hardcore Democrats on one side believing that Julian Assange helped President Trump win and they're working with the Russians and all this craziness. But then on the other side of the political spectrum, you have the people that think Donald Trump is fighting the deep state, and that Donald Trump is taking on the intelligence community. He is in a position, if he so chose to do so at any time, because there's so many war criminals in government, that he could do that. But it's created this situation where people are now okay with Trump ignoring Julian Assange and okay with Trump saying, I don't remember anything about WikiLeaks. And both of those two kind of work hand in hand together to be able to say, well, no, President Trump will bring Julian here to protect him, even though he says he ignores him. And then the Russiagate people say, no, Julian needs to get brought here because he is a criminal. So it creates this bubble where, regardless of what side of the propaganda you're exposed to, it both leads you to the end point of, no, Julian Assange is okay to come to the United States for insert reason, and completely ignores the larger issues surrounding what bringing him here means for the global legal system.
Yes, and the most important lie, in my opinion, that keeps that daisy chain together is the idea, the assertion that the Russian GRU hacked the DNC, gave the emails to WikiLeaks. So that's direct Russian involvement in the bringing Hillary Clinton down in the 2016. If you take that out, Trump had a free hand to do whatever, pardon Assange. Wouldn't be much skin off his back if he did that or anything else. But it's the fact that they've worked so hard to establish this Russia connection. They will not let go of it. They'll grandstand at every single opportunity, every single Sunday show, every single hearing, every single inquiry. They have to give the narrative and lay it out once again, so the American people will become conditioned to believe that Russia interfered in our democracy and pose a threat to the American system, etc. So that lie is so powerful, and it holds together so many other different situations that makes it very difficult to move forward. We're the gears of government, the gears of public opinion, everything are gummed up by a couple of these lies that are like bubble gum. And you can't get them out, you can't dislodge them. They're just stuck there forever, it seems. So I don't know what it's going to take to loosen that up a little bit, but until that happens, we're going to be living in a very difficult discourse where we can't have an honest political discourse about anything.
What we're hoping for with the vigils and with the Action for Assange Network and everything we're trying to do with organizing protests and getting groups started is to try to be the intermediary to fill those voids and to inject that dialogue about Julian Assange stood up for the American people, to show us what our government's doing. And hopefully it turns into a grassroots organizing effort to where we can have people going door to door and knocking and saying, hey, do you remember about this issue? Because it's something that is important than any other political situation that's going on right now, even if you're someone that supports climate change. Because if we can't have the facts of what's going on, we can't act accordingly as educated people.
Yeah. You need a free look. If you don't, this president right now, I've said this publicly, by the way, is laying waste to the First Amendment. This DOJ, this president, blame whoever you want. It's an attack on the First Amendment. Anybody that claims to be a patriot, claims to be a conservative or a libertarian or a liberal, whatever. The Democrats seem to be doing a lot of lecturing about the Constitution lately, I've noticed. So they all should be focusing on this. I mean, this is like an open door. If you really wanted to defeat Trump on a matter of principle, the door's already open. You just have to push it a little bit. He's already exposed himself with this case. And if they were paying attention, the press, they could destroy Trump. It could eviscerate him over this issue, just on anything that's been announced each week. It's just one bad thing after another. Both parties, both sides of the media as well, have basically stepped back and it's hands off on this issue. I cannot believe it. It's so, if they really hate Trump, I mean, a direct attack on the First Amendment. I mean, when has that ever happened? Any U.S. president, you know?
They do have a perfect opportunity to oppose him on an issue that they have opposed him on before, which is his attack on the press. He's called CNN fake news, and they were okay with, condemning him for saying that. However, when it comes to this specific publisher, Julian Assange, and this journalist, they don't want to go there. What I found really to be a very interesting and perhaps incorrect interpretation of the Constitution, the First Amendment, was the fact that the Espionage Act of 1917 does apply to a non-citizen. However, the First Amendment does not. And I believe that in the United States, the intention, originally at least, was that our system was meant to be inherently in favor of the common person. And that interpretation of the Constitution is completely contradictory to that.
Well, it actually meets the legal precedent that you're seeing them try to set in impeachment right now, which is that the national security state trumps the actual public functioning of our government, even as far down as the arguments they make about what Donald Trump did in regards to Ukraine. They're literally saying you deviated from standard national security foreign policy, therefore you are wrong. And you see it playing out with what they're doing with the Espionage Act too, where they're saying these national security laws supersede the United States Constitution. And if that's allowed to play out, and a ruling like that is actually allowed to even move forward in the domain of our legal system, it literally allows them to say, well, in what other circumstance would you be allowed to put national security above constitutional right? Which they've done a multitude of other times, from everything from the Second Amendment to the time, place, and manner limitations set on the First Amendment, as well as things like privacy and our right to not be spied on by our government. So
trying to tack national security charges onto people who were arrested at Standing Rock. That's where we're at, where oil pipelines are part of our national security.
Yeah. No, it's the blurring. You can reinterpret, and this is already happening, by the way. They're reinterpreting national security to be, it's fungible, to be national interest. So how do you define national interest? That could be anything. You're getting a very wide berth there in terms of defining that. And then, so what is in the national interest? So if I say something that is challenging U.S. foreign policy publicly, or I go on Iranian television and say it, even worse, or Russian television, and then that is harming the U.S. in national interest. So that speech is hurting the national interest. So you'll see this transition from national security to national interest, and that's a dangerous phase of this metamorphosis that we're looking at.
National interest, in so many words, is literally the textbook definition of fascism: the merger of economic and political power.
Exactly.
Boil it down to its most basic terms. So the fact that they'll even remove the veil of security in favor of the word interest is horrifying.
Yes, that's exactly correct. Because then corporate interests, then interests of profit, or U.S. industries, or U.S. jobs, or whatever, becomes national interest. So actually, you're spot on. And Benito Mussolini would give you the nod right now, saying, "Thank you very much." You just defined it perfectly.
To kind of elaborate to it too, our war machine is part of that, because every district in the United States, red, blue, doesn't matter, has some industry directly tied to foreign conflicts, whether it's small scale manufacturing companies that make wrenches and sockets that get sent overseas to oil rigs, or it's the large Raytheons and Halliburtons that actually supply the bombs, planes, and guns.
Yeah, and I lived right next to the Apache Boeing plant in Mesa, Arizona, and so this is why John McCain held court for so long in the U.S. Senate is he brought Raytheon jobs, he brought Boeing jobs to Arizona, and that translates into votes. It translates into fantastic support from the defense lobby, and all this is happening all over America. So yeah, they break up the production line and spread it out to spread as many jobs to as many constituencies, and this is what senators represent in the U.S. 2 senators per state that they'll bring a bit of that. So if there's anything in terms of cutting the defense budget, and that will cause pain to any particular state, then nobody wants to do it, Democrat or Republican. They don't want to trim the U.S. defense budget, so it just keeps growing and growing. And it's laughable because Russia spends probably about maximum 80 billion a year on defense, but what it costs them to produce state-of-the-art battlefield stealth helicopter, and what it costs the United States to produce its comparable product is a difference of something like tenfold. So, that goes for just about everything in the U.S. now. The defense industry, like our medical industry, is just completely inflated. It's got its own economy within itself.
Oh, the F-35 is the best
Subsidized by the
example.
American taxpayer. It's a form of elite socialism, or it's
Yeah.
there's no daylight between the government and the corporation, particularly when our tax dollars are going to make sure that we can go annihilate brown people in a different country.
Yeah, and so we have to spend 10 times more than if another country did pretty much the same thing. So that's why it's pushing over $1 trillion right now. And so anybody who's anti-war, who's exposing war crimes, who's going to threaten U.S. Foreign policy or the America reserving the right to have bases in X, Y, and Z countries and have that kitted out. Anybody challenging that, threatening that, is threatening U.S. national interests, which are really corporate interests. But yeah, so America doesn't have national interests; it has corporate interests.
Right.
100%.
And also, too, because the intelligence agencies among the Five Eyes countries in particular are very interconnected, these other countries like New Zealand and Australia, the UK, Canada, their foreign policy interests are somehow dictated by the US government and the NSA in particular. And then also we know there's a Two Eyes agreement between the US and Israel, which reminds me of the conversation that we had earlier. That is a very dangerous thing. And I've said that if we want to be anti-war, we have to be pro WikiLeaks, pro free speech, free press. And also, too, we have to realize that this is a much bigger issue than just President Trump. And there's a whole other orchestrated series of events that's happening behind the scenes that we're not able to see. And we know this because of their own intelligence documents.
Sure. Yeah. No. Like for instance, I'll give you an example. The New Zealand, which you know a lot about, Taylor, because of Susie Dawson's story. Australia, just next door. A lot of people aren't aware still that Australia hosts one of the biggest NSA listening stations called Pine Gap. Okay, there's a good film called The Falcon and the Snowman that was a great film in the 80s with Timothy Hutton. And that tells a little bit of the story of that whistleblower who really was did it on principle, working for the NSA, blew the whistle, or was a contractor, I think, might have been a CIA contractor. But what the U.S. was doing was giving orders to Australian intelligence, ASIOs, was giving direct orders. And when Australia elected a Labor government and came into power, Gough Whitlam was the prime minister. And he was effectively overthrown in a soft coup, and that was directed by the CIA. And they had him removed via the Director General's office. But there was this understanding that there will not be a left-wing government or an anti-war government in Australia because they wanted transparency at Pine Gap. Pine Gap was running all of the bombing coordinates for the Vietnam and Australia's role in the Vietnam War, which we don't hear a lot about, but they were very much involved with the US. And of course, there was a backlash from the anti-war movement and from the labor and lefties in Australia at that time. They wanted to completely extricate themselves from the Vietnam War. The Labor government, Whitlam came in, made some sweeping statements, and that the word went straight from Washington, right? He's going, and they had him thrown out of office. They did the same thing with the previous threat of a Labor government through a complicated spy story. It was really kind of a fake spy story, the Petrov affair. But what it did was effectively demonize in the public's mind the viability of any kind of socialist or left-wing government. I'm not picking sides one way or the other politically. I'm just stating a fact, is that one of the US's raison d'etre from the Second World War was to oppose Soviet influence in the Cold War. And that, but really that was, to me, window dressing. It was about opposing any government that's left of center. And they did this methodically right across the planet. And the Five Eyes is absolutely important in that. And this happened just a few months ago, by the way, in Britain. The campaign to demonize Jeremy Corbyn wasn't just about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. That was another kind of faux demonization campaign. But the big one was from the national security experts that said that if Corbyn became prime minister, that they would stop sharing intelligence. The US would stop sharing intelligence with Britain and put us all at risk to a terrorist attack and so forth. This was all front page in the Times, big center spreads with graphics and everything of why Corbyn would be a disaster for national security. That's exactly the same program they rolled out for the Australian prime minister to throw out Gough Whitlam in 1975, like chapter and verse, basically. There's a few good books written about this. One's called, I think, Secrets by Brian Toohey, an Australian writer. But history, we're out of the Cold War, but you see the identical operations going on to literally throw out. Tony Blair was fine because he pulled the Labour Party to the right and was very pro-war. He was on board with Iraq, everything. So that wasn't a problem. New Labour was very right-wing compared to previous Labour governments. Bill Clinton pulled the Democratic Party right past the center threshold, right to the right. But anytime there's any threat of anything that might pull it back, and all the things that go with that, you'll see the deep state, whatever you want to call it, the CIA, the intelligence agencies, elements in the media, in an absolute coordinated fashion to change the political landscape very, very quickly.
They asked Margaret Thatcher once what her greatest accomplishment was, and she gets this like sick grin on her face, and she says, Tony Blair and New Labour.
True. Yeah,
that was her greatest, and that just, it's always struck me as like, okay, yes, that's accurate, but holy crap, you're evil. Part and parcel to running roughshod over every country that wanted to be slightly to the left of the United States was the complete destabilization and co-opting of the labor movement. And it started, really in the late 1800s. But from the 30s to the 60s was just brutal, bloody, violent. And then the union bosses learned how to play ball with management. And we've had since then, 40, 50 years of union bosses working on behalf of management to screw over workers. And people have lost a lot of faith in labor unions in general, without a genuine labor or genuine workers political party, which we don't have and we haven't had, and we aren't going to get in the framework that we currently have. Without that, we're screwed. At least for any kind of agency in the political sphere. how do I want to put this? Um, do you see a way where without like bloody and violent upheaval, you see a path for a genuine labor movement in any of the Five Eye countries?
I don't. I think you're touching on a very important point, which is that's not just in the U.S. That's a global. This is a global phenomenon, a global condition. So what does that mean? It means that there's no viable political opposition, and so this is a breeding ground for maybe a slightly more extreme right wing flavor of politics. So you could say fascism, corporatism, and all those things, power, basically power politics, raw power. The Labour Party is irrelevant now in the UK, effectively, just by its name, Labour. There's no union, so how can you have a Labour Party? So you don't have the working class anymore. You have the working poor. So this is a big problem. This means that politics as we once knew it is redundant. So there's a couple of good authors that have written some good books recently that say that we're in the post-political epoch now. We've already entered it. And so right and left as old sides of the paradigm no longer represent issues. They no longer represent the human condition in the post-enlightenment world. So what is it? So who's going to win in this transition phase? It's going to be the person who's the most forceful, who's quick, who's got the most money, who is able to buy off the opposition. It's a brutal phase of potentially a politics we're in right now, very dangerous phase where a lot of things that we took for granted before are being threatened or being crushed. And we're talking about these issues right now, of course, with the First Amendment, Julian Assange, free speech, things that I grew up thinking were sacrosanct. Didn't care who was going to get elected. No one's touching that, But now we're questioning these things fundamentally, and that's pretty frightening. That's not the America that I was taught, that I lived in, that I would, enjoy for the rest of my life and hand down to my kids and their kids. So now
So
we're
what
having
do
to
you
fight
think?
for that.
So, fortunately, we have seen, and I'm very cautiously optimistic with that, but I was surprised to see that they are actually holding events throughout the United States as this extradition hearing approaches to bring awareness of the legal repercussions that we will face as a country if Julian Assange is extradited to the United States, tried and convicted. There's legal scholars who are going to be speaking about that, which I think is a good thing. And I'm actually quite frankly surprised that they're able to pull this off at national press clubs in the United States, because none of them have really been supportive of Julian Assange. I think recently a few other organizations have issued formal statements in support of him, but I was largely surprised by this. How do you see this playing out in the future? And where do you think we need to focus most of our efforts right now to ensure that he is not brought to the US and convicted?
Yeah, so the first issue is the extradition issue. So the brunt, the majority of effort there is going to be hopefully from the British public, putting pressure on there, and it would help if there was backing on the U.S. side, saying no, we don't want him extradited here, and he's not going to get a fair trial here. He's not end up in the Eastern District of Virginia National Security Court. He's not going to get a fair trial, and it's going to be embarrassment as well. I, it's a Is that opposition there? It is with the grassroots, and that's good. Of course, we know this could be a lot easier if someone would make it an election issue. If Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, was a front-running candidate, she would make it an election issue and use it to challenge her opponent directly. But that's not going to happen. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. So we're left with the grassroots effort. So I think the most effective thing in the United States is to hound and shame mainstream pundits and journalists, saying, well, what do you think about this issue? What's your stance on this issue? Like harassing them on social media, out in public, doorstepping them, this could be an effective way, and then put those clips viral. This could be an effective way to, get this issue. In other words, you need to have a stance on this issue. You can't just not talk about it. You force them to talk about it. That if a high-profile Hollywood person or a high-profile activist comes on and makes a big splash on this issue, that would change public opinion radically, and it would help. I'm not saying it would turn the tide, but it would make other mainstream type people feel more confident to step up and have an opinion about it. And that's we're at that juncture now where that might happen. I feel like we're on the cusp of that right now, where all
Part
of
of
this grassroots work will pay off very soon.
Part of the reason we started Action for Assange was actually to be calling out independent media for either not talking about this or reporting falsely on this. And so there's been a lot of discussion and debate on how best to go about that. And it's really disappointing to see progressive voices, or so-called progressive voices, repeat CIA talking points and repeat corporate media talking points, which are basically the same thing, really, about Julian Assange on an independent platform. That to me makes absolutely no sense. So we have made a point to try to call them out and urge them to issue an apology and retraction for those statements. I think that could be a helpful way to make it a shameful thing to be repeating misinformation on this case.
Yeah, I mean, more powerful than that, though, is to use use the judo tactics to leverage. For instance, we have a case in the UK right now. Supposedly, the wife of a diplomat was caught in a hit and run, killed a 19-year-old British kid, and then didn't stop, basically, and left the country, and was claiming diplomatic immunity. And we thought that her husband was a diplomat, and turns out he's not. He's an intelligence agent. And the victim's name was Harry Dunn. It was a 19-year-old kid, I think, hit on a motorcycle. Now, it didn't stay to be questioned by the police, didn't cooperate with law enforcement, claiming diplomatic immunity. Now, there can be pressure that can be applied on this issue because this door swings both ways with regards to Assange. So if you have an opinion on this diplomatic immunity case, you should also have an opinion equally on Julian Assange's extradition as well. And there's a number of other things, parallel, similar cases that you can tie together in order to create a little more leverage on this issue. Because certainly there's people that are, feeling strongly about some of these related issues. You need to be smart, be able to identify which ones you can tie together, and then use them to extract a position from somebody at a town hall meeting. In this coming election, you have primaries running right across the country. Great opportunity to collar people, either press or politicians running for president, aides, personalities. They're all there, basically. So it's a good opportunity to use that to doorstep people at events and to do it on camera, for instance.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because doorstepping is something that I feel like has been a lost form of journalism, or at least one that's become like shamed because of outlets like TMZ and whatnot. But it's such an effective way to get an honest answer out of whomever you're walking up to at the moment. And I couldn't agree with that more. I would like to encourage the chat at this point to go ahead and be that activist, and please, let us help you get your footage out there. That's what we're here for. Oh, god damn it. I'm still frazzled from
I'll give you one. I'll just give you one thing that people can do. You go to, for instance, a Liz Warren town hall meeting, or you doorstep Liz Warren outside of the town hall, whatever, on camera,
right
and
in the
say,
selfie line,
and say, do you support Donald Trump stripping Julian Assange of his First Amendment rights when he's extradited to the U.S.? Simple question.
So
Get a simple answer. Yeah.
There's a gentleman named Dak Rouleau that does a really good job of that, getting questions in when he can. And he managed to get a question out to Bernie Sanders about Julian Assange. And Bernie's reply was, now's not the time. Like, I'm aware of the issue, but I can't talk about it right now. And like, to me, seeing someone who 4 years ago I looked to as a leader now turning their back on the person that literally exposed how the election was rigged against him, it's just really disheartening, because that's a person that should be standing up, and that's a person that has the ability to bring so many other voices along with him on it. So I'm just
Totally.
I'm hoping that more pressure can be applied through the progressive left to get the candidates actually talking about it.
Yeah, go after Bernie on that issue for sure. Until I know he definitely wants to avoid it because it's too controversial and it's too complicated. Tulsi Gabbard wasn't afraid to be very clear and clean on that issue. Rand Paul, who's a Republican, he's been very straightforward, very clear. His position is very clear. The rest of them need to clarify their position. They need to be.
Well, silence is the position to me. Last week on the vigil, we actually read through part of Martin Luther King's speech, "Silence is a Betrayal," and it literally outlined the mannerism of Bernie Sanders, that person that's just too scared to stand up to the state when they have the ability to do so.
Yeah, I know. I have nightmares about Bernie as president, with the Joint Chiefs standing around, peering down at him as he's in his chair, shrugging his shoulders, thinking, I don't want to do it. I don't want to go to war. But then he goes and does it anyway, if they push him hard enough. But so basically what you're saying is you need real leadership. You need leadership on the issue.
Our position has always been that if he is not willing to mention Julian Assange, and that's Bernie, if he is not willing to mention Julian Assange's name right now and answer the question that was posed to him by Dak Rouleau and say that he does support Julian Assange and that he does not agree with this administration's charging him with various crimes, if he's not going to say that now, it's illogical to then make the conclusion that he is actually going to do these things when he is in office, when he has to face the Democratic establishment, the Republican establishment, and the intelligence community.
I think if U.S. politicians will move with whatever direction the press is pushing them normally, okay? So if the press or their partisan press, Donald Trump moves where Fox directs him normally, and the Democratic candidates Barack Obama was he was fearful of his base. He was afraid of Al Sharpton. Okay, this is why his policy played out domestically the way it did, because he didn't want to lose his base. Donald Trump is also somewhat fearful of his base as well, or losing any of his base. So they all fear losing their base because the media are the ringmasters on this circus. And so the media, so I think we live in we have a potential to shame members of the mainstream media by social media, by Twitter, by catching them on threads and getting them to ignore, deny, or abstain from an opinion or a comment on some issues. Shame them basically on social media. It works, by the way. I've had success shaming mainstream journalists to talk about Chelsea Manning, for instance, or on different issues. People it's trying to avoid me, but I tagged them, and I tagged some activists, and I tagged their pet demographic on that, and then they had to comment at that point. They panicked, and they had to say something. So we can use Twitter. If you know how to use Twitter strategically, you can get results from Twitter. Trust me, it works. But you got to really, you got to join up with people, and you have to teamwork it on Twitter. But you can do a lot on Twitter in terms of getting people. We got we shamed Amnesty International. We shamed the National Union of Journalists. All these people that disavowed Julian Assange when he was bundled out of the Ecuadorian Embassy. They all came around eventually. It's because everybody kept asking them, how come you're not supporting him? It's just constant. They got a constant barrage of people like that. And another example is even Stop the War Coalition. They were late to the game supporting Julian Assange. but they came around eventually. But those big organizations move a bit slower because they have to vote on everything. They have steering committees, and they're a bit slow. They're not like fast to react as a grassroots activist, but they got there eventually. But the National Union of Journalists, they were standoffish on that issue. Not anymore. Now they have their banner there. They're behind it. It took them 6 months or so. And same with Amnesty International. They're still a bit on the fence. They said he's not a prisoner of conscience. Can you imagine?
Amnesty International is not like they're there to defend, you know, mainstream targets or what, you know, pro-Western journalists.
Yes.
They're not really looking out for WikiLeaks. I was just in San Francisco over the weekend, and I went to a Free Assange rally, and at the same time, or right after, Answer Coalition was marching for a no war on Iran protest, and no one from Answer Coalition came over, stood with us, grabbed a sign, talked to us. It was a little disheartening, but the more I looked at what they were about, the more it looked like an anti-Trump protest rather than an anti-war protest. And I feel like that is one of the more nefarious things that's taken place in the last couple of decades, is making any kind of anti-war sentiment be just about the person in the White House and not about the overarching reach of the military industrial complex.
That's a horrible place that we're at right now, where everything is segregated along partisan lines. You know, you pick the issue up now, but you won't pick it up when the next guy comes into office just because this is the way that we're behaving right now. But I think that people, if they understood the constitutional implications of this right now, and has now come out in the open in the last couple of weeks now, what the real intention of the Department of Justice is with regards to the First Amendment. I think, you know, if there's any bipartisan issue that's so fundamental, every single Bill of Rights is built on top of the First Amendment. So if the First Amendment is compromised or you lose it in any way, shape, or form, then the rest of it is really a house of cards, and it's not worth the paper it's written on. So if you have to communicate this to Democrats and Republicans, it's very hard though, because I often wonder if how much people care about our rights, because, you know, history is so far in the rearview mirror for us with regards to major wars, major domestic upheavals, and things like this. Is this a generational problem? Have we reached the end of our tether in terms of, you know, freedom and convenience to whereby we no longer value our rights anymore, or privacy? They can make an argument that that's a dangerous place that we're at right now.
Absolutely. And as the role of the media shifted from manufacturing consent to manufacturing confusion, which is what the corporate media does now, it makes it so that everything is political, everything is immediately divisive. What sports team you like says a lot about who you are politically now. It is
it's like Europe. That's what Europe is like.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you're what is it? If you're like Liverpool, you're a certain political party. If you're Man U, you're a certain political party.
Yeah, there's a little bit. I mean, when I was in Lebanon, the basketball professional basketball league there, it's very high level, top American players playing there. But you have Sunni teams, you have Christian teams, Hezbollah teams, and they have armed army with Kalashnikovs guarding the away stand inside of a gym. And political money gets poured into sports as well. So I mean, Europe is like that. With some football teams, like you said, they tend to reflect certain, you know, provinces or parties or left or right or ethnic groups as well. And if America's going in that direction, that's not good.
And there's going to be a nonstop military recruiting commercial going on the entire freaking time that US taxpayers ostensibly kick in for to sponsor, like blatant propaganda in the middle of your sports ball. It's we've made politics religion because we're becoming more secular as a nation. We've got a media that manufactures confusion. It's a very dangerous time, which I feel is why something's got to break.
Mhm.
You know, we are starting to see movement from a number of different sectors on speaking out and standing up for Julian Assange. I do feel like that's going to snowball as we get closer to extradition, but only if we keep the pressure on
Yeah.
the types of individuals that we need a reaction out of to move the people who are constantly distracted and permanently confused.
Yeah. The Unity for J, they were doing those vigils with Joe Loria
Mhm.
and Susie and them, and over the course of weeks and months. And the most interesting ones that I found from the U.S. side were the people who were the legal advisors. One from the Yale, one of the charity or foundation, legal foundation with young guy, and some of the others too, talking about, you know, where this case would sit in terms of appeals and what its chances are if it does go the distance to, let's say, the Supreme Court, where the American Civil Liberties Union is on this. All of these groups need to be mobilized in the U.S. and they themselves have good media. Some of them still have good, you know, good media channels, access to media, for instance, ACLU and people like this. These are the people that are going to be fighting on this case. That are going to be on the front lines and advocating every day on, you know, various news programs if it does come to that, or doesn't, or keeping him from being extradited even. But so, you know, there's a lot of mobilization that can happen, I think. But gosh, our elections are like 18-month, 2-year affairs now, and they just suck up so much media capital and currency that they do crowd out real issues. Seems to be a chronic condition of the U.S. System these days.
Yeah, it's a huge distraction, and we have to spend this time talking about what Elizabeth Warren has said, or we have to talk about this impeachment versus talking about issues that are important in talking about Julian Assange and
It's the biggest
escalating
press
tensions
freedom
with
trial of the ever. It's the biggest press freedom trial in history, and we got to talk about Adam freaking Schiff, or or like Dave Chappelle likes Andrew Yang, or some, it's
Yeah, and it's really easy for people to get caught up in that because there are incentives to covering the candidates. There are financial incentives to doing so. You get more views, more likes,
Oh
more
yeah,
subscribers because it's a much more interesting topic. People don't necessarily always want to hear about these legal issues that are very complicated. They don't necessarily want to hear about potential conflicts overseas and in the Middle East. So that's a huge problem. Patrick, I don't know how much longer you have with us, but I do want you to, before you do head out, if you have to soon, I want you to just provide some of your final thoughts, statements, and just a message you want to leave us and our viewers with about the seriousness of Julian Assange's persecution.
yeah. So what I can say is that I think if you look back 10 years ago, 2010, hundreds, thousands of people coming to these WikiLeaks events. Julian Assange, they were rock stars, okay, rock stars of the left. They're opposing the Bush war machine at the time. Now it's the level of support in terms of numbers right now are nothing near that level. However, the support now is much more dedicated. It's much more passionate. It's much more focused, and there's a lot of talented people, very diverse, a big tent, and that's down to the efforts of all the different grassroots, organizers and people like yourself and like other groups doing similar things. It has made it a really broad-based support, very diverse, and a lot bringing together, marshaling together a lot of different people and talents from different places too. It's international. It's from it's not regional or local. It's fully internationalized. So there's a lot of positives, and I think that's going to. I think it's going to hit a tipping point, and I think it'll be in the next 2 months. The tipping point of support will happen, and I think it'll peak at the end of the second part of the hearing in May. There'll be plenty of distractions, plenty of wars, bombing, and things going on around the world, that plenty of excuses to abandon this issue, or the U.S. Political race will be ramping up heading into the conventions in June. But I think it's still going to be there, and I think it's still going to be important. And a lot of smart people are now picking the issue up. And I think I've seen people, once they turn on this issue, they don't go back on it. So it's just going to increase. More influential people, more intellectuals, more writers, more journalists, more thought leaders, more people that can rally more support, and people you can't ignore, basically. And so I'm very positive. I said this before Christmas. I'm very positive. You have to be positive. If you're not positive, you can't. What's the point of being in it? You got to be positive. But I genuinely think that we're seeing now a tipping point. It's happening already. You can see it.
All right. Patrick Henningsen, thank you so much for joining us. It was much anticipated to have you come on these vigils, and we're grateful that you were able to take the time out. We know it's late for you there in the UK. So again, thank you very much. And I believe that Steve and I'm about 99% sure that he and I will be in London during this extradition hearing to cover it. So maybe we will cross paths while we're there. But thank you again.
Okay, sounds good. Look forward to that.
Okay,
Thanks
and everybody that is watching right now, guys, we had a little bit of a time change tonight, but we are going to end this portion of the stream, and we will reconvene at around 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So we are going to log off right now, but okay, I have my times wrong.
Program.
So let me repeat that, guys. Not 9 o'clock, 10 p.m. our normal time that we are usually on. We will be going live again. That is 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I want to thank you guys all for watching and tuning in, and we will see you shortly.